That night, I left my farm for a roadside diner after a call said a package from my late wife had arrived. I had just sat down when a strange soldier and his dog approached, took the seat across from me and said in a serious voice, "Pretend to be my father. No matter what happens, don't leave your seat." Before I could process it, men in black stormed in and surrounded our table. "I'm grateful to have you here. To help us connect, could you share which city or country you're watching from tonight? Your presence means a lot. Also, please note, this story includes fictional elements for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or settings is coincidental, but the message conveyed remains useful." The last light of an October Friday was bleeding out across the fields when I finally sat down at the kitchen table and admitted to myself that I had nowhere to be. The cotton was in all 340 acres of it, stripped clean and hauled off 2 weeks ago, leaving nothing behind but row after row of bare stalks standing crooked in the cold delta wind. The fields looked exactly the way I felt, emptied out, harvested of purpose, and not entirely sure what the next season was supposed to hold. My name is Walter Dunmore. I am 74 years old, and 6 months ago I lost the only person who ever made this place feel like more than just dirt and debt. Corinne had been a Beaumont before she was a Dunmore. These fields belonged to her grandfather, Raymond Beaumont, before they belonged to anyone else, soil she'd inherited, because he said she had the kind of spine this land deserved. When we married 41 years ago, she brought that land into our life quietly and completely. Now she was gone, and I was still sitting in the same chair at the same table, staring at the empty seat across from me that I had learned, slowly and badly, not to look at. I had not left this property after dark since her funeral. Not once. The places we used to go together didn't feel like the same places anymore, and I wasn't ready to find that out all over again. I was heating up a bowl of soup I wasn't going to finish when my phone rang. The number was familiar Loretta Givens, who ran the Millstone Diner on Highway 61. She and Corinne had always shared the easy kind of conversation between two women who didn't need to explain themselves to the world. "Walter?" Her voice carried that slow Clarksdale cadence that made everything sound like it had plenty of time. "Sorry to bother you, but I've got something here, a package, left by a fellow who said he knew Corinne. Said he was just passing through and didn't have your address. He seemed like he meant well." A package from someone who knew Corinne. The thought moved through me like the wind through the screen door, finding every hollow place I'd been trying to ignore. "I'll come by," I said. The drive down Highway 61 took 12 minutes. The night was clear and cold, the delta sky so wide it made my truck feel like a toy. The last time I'd driven this road on a Friday night, Corinne had been in the passenger seat with her shoes off, and the window cracked 2 inches. She said the cold air kept her awake, but I think she just liked the smell of the fields at night. I turned into the gravel lot of the Millstone Diner. The place hadn't changed in 30 years. The neon sign above the door hummed orange and white, casting a restless glow against the darkness. Through the plate glass window, I could see the familiar worn vinyl booths, the color of old mustard, and the low yellow light that made everything inside look like a faded photograph. Loretta was at the counter when I pushed through the door. She gave me a smile that didn't ask for anything. "Walter, glad you made it out. Let me just check in the back for that package." As she disappeared into the kitchen, I took in the sounds, the hiss of the coffee machine, the distant clatter of dishes, and a steel guitar crying softly from the radio. I chose the booth we'd always taken second from the window left side. Corinne always insisted I sit facing the door because she said I was restless if I couldn't see the room. I folded my hands and waited. That was when I noticed him. In the far corner, tucked into the shadows, a young man sat alone. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a dark canvas jacket that had seen hard weather. His hair was cut short, the kind of cut men get when they've spent time in places that require it. He had a coffee in front of him he wasn't drinking and a plate of food he hadn't touched. He wasn't looking at either. He was looking at the door, not with the expectation of a man waiting for a friend, but with the steady measuring patience of someone prepared for whoever walked through it next. At his feet lay a dog, large, black and tan, with ears that stood straight up. It wasn't sleeping. Its eyes were open, tracking the room with a quiet intensity that made the animal seem less like a pet and more like a second set of eyes for the man. There was something in the stillness of that corner, a silence that didn't belong to the rhythm of a Friday night diner. It made the back of my neck feel the way it does before a storm rolls in off the river. Outside, a car turned slowly into the gravel lot. Its headlights swept across the glass, blinding the room for a second, and then went dark. I have lived 74 years on this earth, and one thing that much living teaches you is the difference between a man who is resting and a man who is waiting. Resting men let their shoulders drop. They look at their food. They check their phones, or they stare out the window at nothing in particular. The way people do when their minds have gone somewhere easier. They take up space without thinking about it. The young man in the corner booth was not doing any of those things. He sat with his back flat against the wall and his hands loose on the table. And he looked at the front door of the Millstone Diner, the way a person looks at something they've already decided how to respond to. His jacket was dark canvas, worn at the elbows, the kind of coat that had been through weather and hadn't complained. His hair was cut close on the sides the way men wear it, when someone else used to tell them how to wear it. And his jaw carried a few days of stubble that didn't make him look careless, just like a man who had other things on his mind. He couldn't have been more than 35 or 38. But there was something in his stillness that felt older than that. The dog at his feet was part of the stillness. Large, maybe 80 or 90 pounds, with a coat that was black across the back and tawny along the legs and chest. Its ears stood straight up like two antennae, and it lay with its chin just above the floor eyes, moving slowly around the room. It wasn't sleeping. It wasn't restless. It was doing exactly what its owner was doing, watching and waiting and giving nothing away. Then it looked at me. Not toward me. At me. The way certain animals look at you when they've already figured out more than you've told them. I held its gaze for a moment, and then feeling faintly foolish, I looked back down at my coffee. Loretta came by a few minutes later with the pot. She refilled my cup without asking the way she always had, and I nodded my thanks. That fellow in the back, I said, keeping my voice low. He a regular. She glanced over her shoulder, casual the way someone looks when they've already looked 100 times. Been coming in 3 nights a week for the past 3 months, she said. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Almost always that same booth. Orders coffee, shares whatever he eats with the dog, and watches the door. She set the pot down on the table for a moment and wiped her hands on her apron. Never causes trouble. Never talks much. Tips decent. You know who he is? No, she said simply. Then she picked up the coffee pot and moved on down the counter. I turned that over in my mind for a moment. 3 months. That was a long time to keep the same seat in a diner 40 miles from anything. Men like that young quiet. Deliberate usually had a reason for being somewhere even if they didn't advertise it. But that wasn't really what was keeping me up at night. Preston was. My son was 47 years old and had been running the business side of the Dunmore operation for the past 6 years, since my knees started making the bookkeeping feel like a reasonable trade-off. He was organized and capable and knew how to talk to bank managers and county officials in a way I never had the patience for. I had trusted him with that. I still did, but something had shifted in the months since Corinne passed, and I couldn't put a clean name to it. It had started small. A comment here, a suggestion there. Had I thought about a financial power of attorney just as a precaution, he said, in case something happened. Had I considered meeting with a specialist, one of those doctors who did regular cognitive assessments for men my age? Nothing to worry about, purely routine. Had I given any thought to restructuring the property management, so that things ran more smoothly, just to take the burden off me, of course? Each conversation on its own was reasonable enough. Taken together, they sat in the back of my throat like something I couldn't swallow. I told myself I was being unfair. Grief makes a man suspicious. I knew that. I had watched it do the same thing to my own father, after my mother passed, turn ordinary kindness into something that looked like maneuvering. Preston was my son. He had grown up in this house, on this land. Whatever else he was mine. I was still working through that argument when my phone vibrated against the table. The screen lit up with his name, Preston. I stared at it for a moment. The phone buzzed a second time, patient and insistent. My thumb moved to the side button, the one that sends a call to voicemail without answering, and hovered there. I pressed it. The screen went dark. I set the phone face down on the table and looked out the window. The glass was fogged along the edges from the cold outside pressing against the warmth in. And through it, the gravel parking lot was awash of shadow and pale light from the diner sign. A black SUV had turned off the highway and was rolling slowly into the lot. It moved without hurry, the way vehicles move when the driver already knows where he is going. It found a spot near the far end of the building away from the other cars and came to a stop. The headlights went out. The engine kept running. I watched it through the fogged glass and felt the same thing I'd felt when I first noticed the young man in the corner. That particular stillness that isn't peace, but the moment just before something stops being still. Behind the counter, I caught a glimpse of Loretta setting down the coffee pot. She had her phone in her hand screen tilted away from the room, her thumb moving quickly across it. Then she slipped it into her apron pocket and picked the pot back up as if nothing had happened. I didn't think much of it at the time. I wish I had paid closer attention. I couldn't tell you how long I sat there watching that black SUV through the fogged-up glass. Long enough for my coffee to go from hot to warm. Long enough for the steel guitar on the radio to finish one song and start another. The engine out there kept running. I could just make out the faint tremor of exhaust rising in the cold air above the hood, and the doors stayed shut and nobody got out. And I kept telling myself that meant nothing. I have never been a man who spooked easily. 74 years on a working farm will cure you of most of your jumpiness if the land doesn't break you first. But there is a particular kind of unease that has nothing to do with fear, the kind that settles in the chest, like a change in barometric pressure, telling you that the weather is about to turn before you can see a single cloud. I was feeling that now. I don't know why I didn't just stand up and leave. I've asked myself that question since turned it over the way you turn a stone in your hand, looking for what's underneath. The honest answer is that some part of me, some small, stubborn part that I hadn't listened to in years, already knew that tonight was going to be different. That leaving would only mean carrying it with me down the highway, instead of facing it here under the yellow lights of a diner I had known for 30 years. So I stayed, and then the young man in the corner stood up. He didn't hurry. He didn't hesitate. He simply unfolded himself from the booth, with the quiet economy of someone who had done difficult things before, and knew that speed wasn't always the same as readiness. The dog, the big black and tan animal I'd been watching all evening, rose at the exact same moment, without a word or a signal that I could see, and fell into step beside him. They crossed the diner together, not toward the door, toward me. I straightened in my seat. My first instinct was to slide out of the booth and put some distance between us, but before I could act on it, the man had already reached the table. He pulled out the chair across from me, Corinne's chair, the one I'd been carefully not looking at all evening, and sat down. He didn't ask permission. He didn't apologize for it. He just sat and placed both hands flat on the table between us. Palms turned upward, fingers open. It was the kind of gesture that said, I am not holding anything. I am not hiding anything. Whatever happens next, you can see my hands. My name is Beckett, he said. His voice was low and unhurried, each word placed with the deliberateness of a man who didn't waste them. Sir, please pretend I'm your eldest son. Whatever happens tonight, don't leave this seat. I stared at him. He had steady gray eyes and a face that had been outdoors in all kinds of weather, and he looked back at me with an expression that was neither aggressive nor pleading. Just direct. The way a person looks when they are telling you something true and don't have time to convince you of it slowly. Who are you? I said. Someone who made a promise, he said. Before I could press him further, I felt a weight settle against my left leg, warm and solid and deliberate. The dog had come around the side of the table and pressed the top of its broad head against my thigh, not pushing, just resting there. The animal's eyes were half closed, but its ears stayed upright, still tracking the room. I looked down at it, then back at the man. What's its name? I asked. I don't know why that was the question that came out. Maybe because it was the one I could actually answer without needing to understand everything else. Flint, he said. I put my hand on Flint's head, and the dog didn't move. And somehow I didn't move either. There are things the body knows before the mind catches up. And whatever my body had decided about this moment, it had decided to stay. I looked at Beckett's hands, still open on the table. That was when I noticed the scar, a pale, thin line across the inside of his left wrist, the kind that didn't come from a kitchen accident or a childhood fall. Old enough to have settled into the skin, but still there if you knew to look. I don't know what made me think of Corinne, but I did. She used to say, and I had heard it enough times that it had worn smooth in my memory, like a river stone. Trust the ones who ask for nothing, Walter. The ones who come with open hands. She said it about neighbors, about hired hands, about the feed store manager, who extended our credit during a bad harvest and never mentioned it again. She said it so often that I used to tease her about it. I wasn't teasing now. This man hadn't asked me for a single thing. He hadn't offered me a deal or an explanation or a way out. He had sat down across from me, put his hands where I could see them, and asked me to stay put. That was all. I had no logical reason to trust him. I had no logical reason not to. How long have you been here? I asked him, meaning the diner, meaning tonight. About 30 minutes before you walked in, he said. I thought about that. About the phone call from Loretta. About the drive down Highway 61. About the package that she still hadn't brought out from the back, and that I had almost forgotten about entirely. I thought about the black SUV still idling in the lot. You knew I was coming, I said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer, which was itself an answer. I leaned back in the booth and looked at him for a long moment. This young man, with his soldier's haircut and his open hands, and his dog pressing warm and steady against my leg. And I thought about what Corinne would have done. She had always been the better judge of people. She had always seen what I was too stubborn or too trusting or too tired to see. I decided to stay in the seat. At that moment, the bell above the front door rang. Not from the wind, from footsteps. More than one set. Measured and heavy coming in out of the cold, with the particular rhythm of people who had already decided what they were going to do when they got inside. There are smells that attach themselves to memory so completely that they stop being smells and become something else entirely. Warnings, maybe, or the particular feeling you get in your chest, right before something goes wrong. I knew Preston had walked through that door before I turned my head to look. His cologne was Italian something he'd been wearing since his mid-30s, the kind that came in a heavy glass bottle and cost more than a week's worth of groceries. Corinne had always said it suited him. I had always thought it smelled like a man who was trying to remind the room that he'd arrived. I turned, and there he was. Preston Dunmore was 47 years old, and looked every bit of it in the way that successful men sometimes do not worn down by it, but shaped by it. the way good leather gets shaped by years of use. He wore a dark charcoal suit that had no business being anywhere near a roadside diner on a Friday night, and his dark hair was combed back cleanly, not a strand out of place despite the October wind outside. He was smiling the smile I had watched him practice since he was a teenager, the one that started at his mouth and stopped just short of his eyes. He looked like a devoted son who had come to bring his father home. Behind him, filling the doorway for a moment before stepping aside, was a man I didn't recognize. Big through the shoulders, somewhere around 40, with a face that had the particular blankness of someone who had trained himself not to show anything. He wore a dark jacket that was a size too large in the way that jackets sometimes are, when there's a reason for the extra room. He didn't look at me. He looked at the room, the corners, the counter, the kitchen door. The way a man looks at a space he's already decided how to control. 3 others came in behind them. Younger, dressed in black, moving with the quiet coordination of people who had been told where to stand and had practiced standing there. One took a position near the door. One drifted toward the far end of the counter. The third stopped near the jukebox, hands loose at his sides. 4 men in total, not counting Preston. Loretta was behind the counter. I watched her hands tighten on the dish towel she was holding, not dramatically, just the small, involuntary tightening of someone who has just understood something they were hoping not to understand. Her eyes moved across the room, once taking inventory, and then she set the towel down on the counter and kept her face carefully neutral. Preston crossed the diner toward my booth. He glanced at Beckett as he approached, one quick, assessing look, the kind you give a piece of furniture you weren't expecting to find in the room. Something moved behind his eyes in that moment, there and gone so fast I might have imagined it. Then he was looking at me, and the smile was back warm and practiced. Dad. He stopped at the edge of the table, one hand resting on the back of the booth. I've been looking for you. Let's go home. I'm having coffee, I said. I can see that. He said it gently, the way you speak to someone you've decided is being unreasonable, but don't want to embarrass. Come on, it's late. You shouldn't be out on your own this time of night. I had heard that particular sentence, or versions of it, more times than I could count in the past 3 months. You shouldn't be driving after dark. You shouldn't be managing the accounts by yourself. You shouldn't have to carry all of this alone, Dad. That's what I'm here for. Each one wrapped in concern so carefully that there was nothing in the words themselves to object to. What you objected to was the space underneath the words, the assumption living there, like something that had moved in without asking. Beckett hadn't moved. He sat across from me with his hands still visible on the table, and he did not look at Preston with surprise or alarm or anything I could easily name. He looked at him the way a man looks at something he was already expecting. Preston's eyes moved to him again, slower this time. I'm sorry, he said, his tone shifting just slightly into something more formal. I don't believe we've met. Beckett said nothing. Preston let the silence sit for a moment, then turned back to me. He leaned down, dropping his voice to something that was meant to be private, but was pitched just low enough to feel like pressure. The doctor is already on his way, Dad. This is just a routine check, a wellness visit, nothing more. We talked about this. You agreed it was a good idea. He paused. Oh, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. I had not agreed to anything of the kind. But that was the nature of those conversations. Preston had a way of describing discussions we'd had that made my own memory feel uncertain afterward, as if what I remembered and what had actually been said were 2 slightly different things, and his version was the reliable one. I looked at the man he'd brought with him, the large, blank-faced one standing just behind Preston's left shoulder, and I realized I had seen that face before. Not here, somewhere else. Somewhere that made the back of my neck go cold when I tried to place it. Before I could, I heard Beckett's voice, low, directed at me, and no one else, the way you speak to someone standing right beside you in a crowd. Stay seated, sir. 3 words. Quiet enough that Preston didn't react to them. Below the table, Flint rose from the floor without a sound. He didn't growl, didn't lunge, didn't do anything sudden. He simply stood and turned, and fixed both amber eyes on the large man behind Preston, with an attention so precise and unblinking that it seemed to make the air in that corner of the diner go very still. Behind the counter, I caught one more glimpse of Loretta. Her phone was in her hand again, held low screen, angled away from the room. Her thumb moved twice across the surface. Then the phone disappeared back into her apron, and she picked up the coffee pot and went back to looking like a woman who was just doing her job. Whatever she was telling someone, she was telling them quickly. There is a particular quality to the silence that falls in a room just before something irreversible happens. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of compression of air being pushed out of the available space by something that hasn't fully arrived yet. The trucker at the counter had stopped eating. The young couple near the window had gone very still. Even the radio seemed to have lowered itself, as if the room had quietly asked it to. I have felt that silence twice before in my life. Once on the morning my father's tractor rolled on the south field. Once on the night the doctor sat down across from me and used the word terminal in a sentence that had Corinne's name in it. I was feeling it now. Preston stood at the edge of my booth, patient, and composed his cologne, mixing with the smell of coffee and fryer grease in a way that seemed almost deliberately wrong. Beckett had not moved. Flint had not moved. 3 men in black stood at their positions around the diner with the stillness of people who had been told to wait and were good at it. Then the bell above the door rang again. The man who came in was not large. He was somewhere in his early 60s, slight through the shoulders, wearing a gray wool overcoat that had been pressed recently, and a pair of thin-framed glasses that caught the light as he stepped inside. He carried a leather document case under one arm, the kind with a brass clasp, wide enough to hold a full-size folder without bending it. His shoes were clean despite the gravel lot outside. He moved through the diner with the unhurried confidence of a man who had walked into difficult rooms before and expected them to accommodate him. I knew that walk. The world did not tilt or blur or go dark the way people describe in stories. It simply stopped. Like a clock that had been running fine and had suddenly, without warning, decided it was done. Because the man in the gray overcoat was Harlan Stowe. And I had not seen Harlan Stowe in 11 years. But a face you have known for 3 decades does not require recent acquaintance to be recognized. He came to the table without being directed to it, as if he already knew the geography of the evening. He set his document case on the edge of the table, unclasped it, and withdrew a manila folder. Inside the folder were several sheets of paper, clipped together with a cover sheet on top. I could read the header from where I sat. Cognitive assessment. Initial evaluation, patient. Walter James Dunmore. Date of assessment, October 18th, 2024. Below the header, there was a checklist. Several boxes. The third one down read, patient shows signs of diminished capacity to manage personal and financial affairs. The box was already checked. Preston put a hand lightly on my shoulder. This is just a preliminary step, Dad. A formality. Dr. Stowe is here to help us make sure you're being properly looked after. I want to be precise about what I understood in that moment, because I think it matters. I had heard the phrase legal guardianship before. You hear it in relation to children or to elderly relatives in the later stages of illness, people who genuinely cannot manage their own affairs. What I had not fully understood until I was sitting in a diner booth at 8 o'clock on a Friday night, staring at a pre-checked box next to my own name, was how the process actually worked. In Mississippi, a guardianship petition begins with a medical certification. A licensed physician evaluates the person in question and signs a document stating that in their professional opinion, the individual lacks the capacity to manage their personal or financial decisions. That document goes to the Chancery Court. A petition is filed. The court appoints an independent attorney for the person being evaluated. A hearing is scheduled. The whole process takes 30 to 60 days. It does not require a locked ward. It does not require a police escort or a court order tonight. It requires paperwork. Filed correctly, witnessed properly, signed by a doctor whose license is in good standing. Harlan Stowe's license had been in good standing for 32 years, and someone had already filled in that checkbox before he had spoken a single word to me. That was the plan. Not to drag me out of here in handcuffs, not to make a scene that witnesses could describe, to sit across from me in a diner, have me sign an acknowledgement that the evaluation had taken place, and walk out with a piece of paper that would start a legal clock running. 30 days from tonight, Preston could be standing in front of a judge with a certified physician's report, a petition for conservatorship over my person and estate, and no one to contradict him, because by then, whatever I said would already be on record as the statements of a man with diminished capacity. I looked at the form for a long time. I looked at the checkbox. I looked at my name printed in clean black type above a line that was waiting for my signature. Then I looked up. Harlan was watching me from behind his glasses with an expression I could not immediately name. Not cruelty, not indifference. Something more complicated and in its own way worse than either. I said his name. Harlan, not a question, not a greeting. Just the name, 2 syllables, flat and unornamented, carrying 30 years of history that neither of us had asked to be sitting inside of right now. His hands, which had been moving to turn to the next page of the folder, went still. The silence that followed that single word lasted perhaps 4 seconds. In that silence, I watched Harlan Stowe's hands remain motionless against the open folder. I watched Preston's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. I watched Beckett across the table sit with the particular stillness of a man who had decided to let something play out before deciding what to do about it. 4 seconds is long enough to understand a great many things. I want to tell you about Harlan Stowe. Not the man standing in front of me tonight with his brass-clasped document case and his pre-checked boxes, but the man I knew for 30 years before this evening. Because I think you need to understand what 30 years looks like before you can understand what it means to watch it come apart in the light of a roadside diner. We met in the fall of 1991 at an agricultural expo in Greenville. I was there looking at new irrigation equipment. He was there giving a talk on rural healthcare access that I stumbled into because it was raining and the tent had chairs. He was 32 years old, recently licensed, and had the kind of enthusiasm for his work that you can't perform convincingly. Either you have it or you don't, and Harlan had it. We ended up at the same bar afterward, talking until the bartender started stacking chairs. Over the next decade, we became the kind of friends that rural men become when they find someone else who doesn't require explanation. We fished the Sunflower River in the early mornings before either of us had obligations. We drove to Jackson for the occasional ball game. When Preston was born, Harlan was in the waiting room. When Harlan's mother passed, I drove 4 hours to stand beside him at the graveside. Corinne liked him. That mattered to me. She didn't like everyone, and she didn't pretend to. But she always set an extra plate when Harlan came to the farm, and she laughed at his stories. And when she disagreed with him, which she did regularly, because Corinne disagreed with everyone regularly, she did it with the ease of someone who respected the person she was disagreeing with. It was Corinne who noticed the change first. Around 1997, she started saying that something was different about Harlan, that he seemed pressured, that his laugh had a hollow place in it that hadn't been there before. I told her she was reading too much into things. In March of 1998, Harlan called me on a Sunday evening and told me his practice was in serious trouble. He had taken on a partner 2 years prior, a man he'd trusted, who had spent the better part of 18 months quietly mismanaging their accounts. By the time Harlan found out the practice owed $47,000, it didn't have, And the state medical board was beginning to ask questions that had no good answers. He didn't ask me for money. I want to be precise about that. He called because he didn't have anyone else to call, and I think he just needed to say it out loud to someone who wouldn't panic. But I had the money, a good harvest, a paid-off equipment loan, and I told him I'd lend it to him without interest and without a formal repayment schedule, because that was what you did for a friend who needed it. Corinne sat across from me at this same kitchen table after I hung up the phone, and she looked at me for a long moment before she said anything. "Patatu," she said, "be careful who you save. Not everyone is worth the cost." I told her she was being unfair to a man who'd done nothing wrong except trust the wrong person. She didn't argue. She just nodded slowly, the way she nodded, when she had already decided she was right and was willing to wait for me to catch up. Harlan paid back $30,000 of the $47,000 over the following years. Then his practice stabilized, and the calls became less frequent. And somewhere in the early 2000s, the friendship simply receded. The way things do when life gets loud, and the distance between people grows without anyone deciding to let it. By 2013, we had not spoken in 2 years. I had not thought about that particularly. I assumed we were simply older. I had not thought about the remaining $17,000 in a long time. I was thinking about it now. Harlan finally looked up from the folder. He looked at me the way a man looks at something he has been trying not to look at directly. Not with cruelty, not with indifference, but with the expression of someone who has made a calculation and is living inside its consequences. There was something in his eyes that was not quite shame, and not quite its absence, and I found I could not name it, which was worse than either option. Preston spoke from his position at the edge of the table, his voice carrying the smooth patience of a man who had prepared for this moment. "This is a medical matter, Dad. Personal history doesn't change the clinical evaluation." I looked at my son when he said that. At the clean line of his jaw, the careful composure of his expression, the hand resting easily on the back of my booth, as if he had all the time in the world. I tried to find in his face the boy who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way home from the hardware store. I couldn't find him. I wasn't sure how long he'd been gone. Beckett sat across from me without speaking. From where I sat, he was simply a young man being very still in a difficult room, and I still did not understand why he had known to be here tonight, or what promise he had made, or to whom. I only knew that his hands were still open on the table, and that Flint was still pressed against my leg, and that those two things felt in that moment like the most stable things in the room. That was when the large man who had come in with Preston moved. He stepped away from his position near the counter, slow and deliberate, and came toward the table. And as he moved into the full light of the overhead lamp, I saw his face clearly for the first time tonight. I had seen that face before, 2 weeks ago. Early morning. Standing outside the gate of my property on County Road 518, asking directions he didn't need, looking at things he had no business looking at. My chest went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the October night outside. Memory does not always wait for a convenient moment. It does not tap you on the shoulder and ask whether you are ready. It arrives when it decides to arrive uninvited and without apology, pulling you out of whatever room you are sitting in and dropping you somewhere else entirely, somewhere you thought you had already finished with. 2 weeks ago. A Tuesday morning, 6 o'clock, the last of the harvest season. The fog was still sitting low over the south fields, the kind of thick delta fog that makes the tree line look like a pencil sketch someone hadn't finished. And I was walking out to check the irrigation shut-off valves before the temperature dropped any further. I heard the truck before I saw it. A dark-colored pickup idling on the gravel shoulder of County Road 518, just outside the front gate of the property. The gate was closed, but not locked. I stopped locking it after Corinne passed, because there was no one to forget the combination except me, and I couldn't see the point anymore. The man standing beside the truck was large, wide through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of build that suggests it was put there deliberately rather than inherited. He was wearing a dark jacket and work boots, and he was looking at the front of the property, the gate, the fence line, the distance from the road to the main house, with an attention that I registered at the time as simply the curiosity of a man who had stopped somewhere unfamiliar. He heard me coming and turned around. "Morning," he said. His voice was flat and even. "Sorry to bother you. I'm trying to find the Marsden property. GPS has been giving me trouble out here." The Marsden property was a real place, a small cattle operation about 4 miles north on County Road 518. I had known the Marsden family for 20 years. I told the man how to get there. "Follow the road north, turn left at the broken windmill, look for the red mailbox." He nodded, thanked me, got back in his truck, and drove away. I stood at the gate for a moment after he left, watching the truck disappear into the fog, and I felt something, not alarm, not suspicion, just a faint displacement. The way you feel when you put something down and can't quite remember where, even though it was only a moment ago. I couldn't name what was wrong with the picture, so I filed it away and went back to the irrigation valves. I understand now what I couldn't name then. A man who is genuinely lost does not study your fence line. He does not look at the distance from your gate to your front door. He does not take in the layout of your property with the slow, deliberate attention of someone who is memorizing it rather than observing it. And he does not ask for directions he could have gotten from any gas station in Clarksdale before driving out into the county at 6 in the morning. He was not lost. He had been sent. I came back to the present and found myself looking at that same man standing 4 feet from my booth in the yellow light of the Millstone Diner. The same flat, even expression. The same jacket. The same deliberate stillness. I said it before I had fully decided to. "You were at my gate 2 weeks ago." He didn't answer. He didn't deny it. Didn't confirm it didn't blink. He simply shifted his gaze from me to Preston and waited. Preston's expression moved through several things quickly. A flicker of recalculation, a brief tightening around the eyes before settling back into the composed, reasonable look he had been wearing all evening. He gave a small, measured smile, the kind that was designed to make the person receiving it feel like they were overreacting. "Security, Dad," he said. "I hired someone to keep an eye on the property, for your safety. The farm's been sitting without full-time help since the harvest, and I didn't want to worry you by making it a whole conversation." I looked at my son for a long moment after he said that. 47 years. I had known this man for 47 years. I was in the room when he took his first breath. I taught him to drive a tractor when he was 12 years old on the South Field, the same field his grandfather had broken ground on in 1959. I had stood at the graveside with him when we buried Corinne, and I had held on to him when his knees gave out. And I had believed in that moment that whatever else was complicated between us, the grief at least was shared. But grief, I was learning, did not preclude calculation. And concern spoken in the right tone of voice was indistinguishable from control until you were already inside it. The man Preston called his security. The man who had stood at my gate at 6 in the morning, memorizing the distance from the road to my front door, pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and glanced at the screen. Something crossed his face. Not alarm, but a tightening. A small, involuntary reaction to whatever was on that screen, quickly suppressed. He looked up, scanned the diner entrance briefly, then put the phone away. I did not know what he had read. I did not know who had sent it. But I had been farming this land for 50 years, and I knew what it looked like when an animal picked up a scent it wasn't expecting. Under the table, Beckett's boot pressed lightly against my foot. Once deliberate, unhurried. I looked down without moving my head. Flint had shifted his position. He was no longer simply standing. He was oriented, the full weight of his attention directed toward the man in the dark jacket, nose lifted fractionally. The fur along his spine raised in a thin, precise line from his shoulders to the base of his tail. Not a growl, not a lunge. Something quieter and more specific than either. The dog had found something in the air that I could not. And whatever it was coming from the man my son had described as security. I have kept dogs my entire adult life. Working dogs, mostly the kind that earn their keep on a farm rather than sleep on the furniture. Border collies for the cattle years, a pair of catahoulas when we ran hogs on the back 40. A old blue-tick hound named Grover, who lived to be 16 and spent his last 2 years doing nothing more strenuous than lying on the porch and watching the road go by. I have watched dogs work, watched them rest, watched them play, and watched them die. And in all that time I learned one thing about them that I trust more than most things I've been told by people. A dog does not perform alarm. It does not exaggerate. It does not warn you about something because it wants attention, or because it is confused, or because the wind shifted and brought something unfamiliar. When a trained dog orients on a specific person and holds that orientation with the precise, unblinking focus that Flint was showing right now, it is because that dog has identified something specific, something real, something its training taught it to recognize. Flint was not afraid of the man standing near our table. Flint had found something on him. Beckett understood this before I finished the thought. He rose from the booth without urgency, without the sharp, aggressive movement that would have changed the temperature of the room immediately. He simply unfolded to his full height, which was considerable, and stood with his weight balanced and his hands loose at his sides, in the way of a man who has been in enough difficult rooms to know that stillness used correctly carries more weight than motion. He looked at Preston. "Ask your man to step back," he said. His voice was even and unhurried, the way a person speaks when they are not making a request, so much as describing what is going to happen. Flint doesn't like what he's carrying under that jacket. Preston's expression did not change, or rather it tried not to change, and almost succeeded. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said pleasantly. "And I don't know who you are, but this is a private family conversation, and I'd appreciate it if—" The large man, the one who had stood at my gate, the one Preston called his security, took half a step backward. It was a small movement. Involuntary. The kind of physical response that happens below the level of decision when the body reacts to being seen before the mind can instruct it otherwise. He caught himself almost immediately and stopped moving, but the half-step had already happened, and everyone at the table had seen it. Preston saw it too. Something shifted behind his eyes, a brief recalculation, a tightening, and then the composed expression returned. But it was not quite the same as before. There was a crack in it now, hairline thin, but there. I understood what had just happened. In 30 years of running a farm, I had negotiated with equipment dealers and county assessors and creditors and drought. I knew what it looked like when someone made a claim they couldn't back up, and I knew what it looked like when someone stated a fact. Beckett had not threatened anyone. He had not raised his voice or moved aggressively or done anything that could be described as confrontational. He had simply said, in the tone of a man reading a number off a gauge, that the dog had found something under that jacket, and the man wearing the jacket had flinched. That was all the confirmation anyone in that booth needed. I looked at the man Preston had brought with him, really looked at him the way I should have looked when he appeared at my gate on that foggy Tuesday morning, and I saw what I had missed then. The way the jacket hung, the slight asymmetry on the left side, the fabric pulling differently than it should at the hip. I had grown up around working men who carried rifles and shotguns and thought nothing of it. I knew what weight looked like on a body that was trying not to show it. Preston changed course. He had the particular adaptability of a man who had prepared for multiple versions of this conversation and kept a reserve strategy for when the first one stopped working. He turned to me. and his expression shifted from composed authority to something softer, more personal, the way a mask slips sideways rather than coming all the way off. Dad. His voice dropped. Mom would have wanted this. You know that. She was worried about you too toward the end. She told me so. She said she didn't know how you were going to manage out here by yourself, and she asked me to make sure you were taken care of. The diner went very quiet. I have thought about what happened inside me in that moment, and I want to be accurate about it. It was not grief, though grief was part of it. It was not confusion. It was something harder and colder and more specific than either of those things. It was the particular anger of a man who has just watched something sacred get picked up and used as a tool. Corinne had been dead for 6 months. She had died in the bedroom of the house she had grown up in, on land that had belonged to her family for 4 generations, with my hand in hers and the sound of the delta wind outside the window. Whatever she had said or thought or hoped for in her final weeks was between her and God and me, and it was not something to be quoted in a roadside diner to pressure an old man into signing a form. My jaw tightened, my hands flat on the table pressed down without my intending them to, and then I heard Beckett's voice. One word spoken quietly, directed not at Preston, not at the large man with the asymmetric jacket, not at Harlan Stowe standing silently beside his open folder, at me. Don't. I looked at him. He was watching me with an expression I still could not fully read, something between steadiness and something older, something that looked almost like recognition, as if he knew exactly what was moving through me right now, as if he had seen this particular kind of pain before, or something that lived close to it. I did not know how a stranger could know that. I did not know yet that he wasn't one. There are certain things that belong to love and not to argument. The way a person took their coffee, the particular laugh they had when something caught them off guard, the sound of their breathing in the dark of a room you shared for 40 years. These things are not sentimental in the ordinary meaning of the word. They are structural. They are the load-bearing walls of a life, and when someone reaches for one of them to use as leverage, something in the body responds before the mind has time to compose itself. Preston had said Corinne's name. He had said it in the careful, weighted way of a man who had chosen it deliberately, who had decided that if reason and authority weren't moving things along, grief might. I looked at my son across the table and said 4 words. Don't use her name. My voice was low. It was not a shout, not a tremor. It was the voice I used when I meant something completely without room for negotiation or reinterpretation. Preston did not step back. He was not the kind of man who stepped back from things. He had inherited that from me, which was not something I took pleasure in noticing at this particular moment. I'm using it because it's the truth, Dad, he said. His tone had modulated again, settling into something between patience and concern, the register of a man who believes he is being reasonable in an unreasonable situation. She was worried about you. She told me so. She said you'd been forgetting things, losing track of details on the property. She was afraid of what would happen when she was gone, and there was no one watching out for you. I sat with that for a moment. I want to tell you what it is like to hear someone describe your wife's private fears to you as an argument. Not as memory, not as grief shared between 2 people who loved the same person, but as evidence in a case being built against you. It is a particular kind of violation that does not have a clean name, and the feeling it produces is not sadness. Sadness is soft. This was something with edges, but underneath the anger, something else was moving. I was remembering the last real conversation I had with Corinne. Not the final hours, which belonged to a kind of silence that I have never tried to put into words, but the last time we talked. The way we always talked at the kitchen table late evening, the fields dark outside the window. She had been tired that week, more tired than she would admit. and she sat with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking, and looked at me for a long time before she spoke. "Walter," she said, "if anything happens, trust the ones who ask for nothing." I had asked her what she meant. She had looked at me with the expression she wore when she thought I was being deliberately slow, which was an expression I had been on the receiving end of for 4 decades and knew very well. "You'll know when you need to," she said. "Just remember it." I had remembered it. I had carried it without understanding it, the way you carry a key for years before you find the lock it opens. Now sitting in this booth with Beckett's hands open on the table across from me, hands that had asked me for nothing, offered me nothing, only told me to stay seated, and then kept that promise without flinching, I was beginning to understand what she had meant. I turned from Preston to Harlan. Harlan had been standing with his folder open, the cognitive assessment form fanned across the table, and now he pushed the top sheet forward a few inches in my direction. His voice when he spoke was the careful, professional voice of a man performing a function. "Mr. Dunmore, if you could just sign here, this simply acknowledges that the initial evaluation has taken place. It's a formality. It doesn't commit you to anything further." I looked at the line, my printed name above it, the checkbox already marked. Then I looked at Harlan. "How much?" I said. Not a question exactly, more like a coordinate. A fixed point I was trying to locate on a map that had been obscured for too long. Harlan's expression did not change. His hand, which had been resting beside the folder, went slightly still. He did not answer. He did not deny it either. That silence told me everything I needed to know about the distance between the man I had lent $47,000 to in 1998 and the man standing across from me now. The friend I had known would have been offended by the question. He would have pushed back, argued, said something sharp in the way of a man whose integrity had been impugned. He would not have stood quietly in the wreckage of 30 years and simply declined to confirm. The silence was its own confession. Preston moved to fill it. "This isn't about money, Dad. This is about making sure—" "Be quiet, Preston." The words came out before I decided to say them. Plain and flat, the way I used to speak to the men who worked the harvest when something needed to stop immediately. Preston stopped. I understood sitting there in that particular silence what I was actually looking at. Not a son who had lost his way. Not a man motivated by fear or grief or the weight of responsibility. A plan. Patient, incremental. Designed to use the instruments of law and medicine and family obligation to arrive at an outcome that could not be achieved by force. The form on the table was not the destination. It was the first mile marker on a road, that if I walked, it would end with someone else's name on the decisions of my life. A bully with a fist was something I knew how to handle. A bully with a briefcase and a licensed physician and a filing date at the Chancery Court was something else entirely. And that something else was standing in my diner wearing my son's face, asking me to sign my name on a line it had already decided for me. My right hand moved without instruction. Not toward the pen. Toward my chest. Toward the left breast pocket of my jacket where I had been carrying Corinne's Bible every day for 6 months. The way a man carries something he cannot explain to anyone else and doesn't try to. My fingers found the spine of it and stopped. Because the book was thicker than it should have been. Not dramatically, not enough that I would have noticed in an ordinary moment, but I was holding it now with the focused attention of a man who had nothing else to hold on to, and I could feel it plainly. Something was inside it that had not been there before. Or rather, something was inside it that I had never thought to look for. We are about to reach the turning point that changed everything. To let me know you're still watching, please drop a 99 in the comments. Your support keeps this story alive. Also keep in mind, some fictional elements follow for entertainment purposes. If you prefer to skip these dramatic twists, you may exit the video now. The last light of an October Friday didn't just bleed across the fields. It seemed to freeze right there in the Millstone Diner. caught in the stale air between the grease-filmed windows and the yellowed ceiling tiles. My hand stayed anchored to my chest, my fingers pressing against the worn leather of Corinne's Bible. The room held its breath. Even the hum of the neon sign seemed to drop an octave, leaving a silence so heavy I could hear the faint metallic ticking of the wall clock behind the counter. Corinne never did anything without a reason. That was the foundational truth of our 41 years together. Every rose bush she planted, every letter she filed, every word she chose in an argument, it was all calculated with a precision that bordered on the prophetic. I had carried this book in my breast pocket for 6 months, a physical weight meant to anchor my grief, and not once had I asked myself why it felt half an ounce heavier than it should. I had been too busy mourning the woman to listen to what she was still trying to tell me. Slowly, with the deliberate care of a man handling a fragile bird, I reached into my jacket and pulled the Bible out. The cover was dark, weathered brown leather, the edges rubbed smooth and pale by decades of her thumbs. As it cleared the pocket, a ghost of her scent, faint lavender, and the iron-dry smell of delta dust brushed against me. It was so sharp, so sudden that for a split second, the diner vanished. I wasn't sitting in a mustard-colored booth facing a predatory sun. I was back in our hallway watching her brush her hair before Sunday service. I laid the book flat on the table right next to Harlan Stowe's pre-checked medical form. As the Bible settled, the spine groaned softly, and a thick white envelope slid from between the pages of the Book of Psalms. It hit the Formica tabletop with a soft thud that sounded like a gavel in the silence of the room. On the front, in the elegant looping cursive that had defined the grocery lists and birthday cards of my life, were 6 words for Walter. When the time comes. I didn't open it immediately. I didn't need to. I just looked at her handwriting the way she always crossed her T's with a slight upward flick and felt a sudden profound stillness wash over me. It wasn't the numbness of shock. It was the quiet clarity that comes when the wind dies down just before a storm. It felt as if Corinne had pulled out the chair beside me and placed her hand over mine. Preston saw it. I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. The mask of the concerned son didn't just slip, it fractured. A thin, jagged line of genuine panic cut through his composed expression, gone in a heartbeat, but vivid enough to leave a trail. He knew that handwriting as well as I did, and he knew that his mother never left anything to chance. I glanced at Beckett. He was watching the envelope not with surprise or even curiosity, but with a gaze so steady it felt ancient. There was something in those gray eyes I finally recognized. Not relief, not victory, but a deep, somber recognition of a debt being paid. It was the look of a man who had seen the end of the road long before the rest of us started walking. I picked up the envelope. I didn't tear it. I just held it, feeling the thickness of the paper inside. "Dad," Preston said. He reached out his hand, hovering over the table, fingers twitching toward the white paper. "Dad, let's not get distracted. You're tired. You're confused. Let me take that. We can look at Mom's old things back at the house where it's private." His voice was still smooth, but the rhythm was off. The Preston Dunmore who negotiated bank loans wouldn't have sounded that desperate. I looked at him, and for the first time in years, I saw the calculation for exactly what it was. He wasn't worried about my health. He was worried about the 340 acres of Beaumont soil. He was thinking about the separate property laws of Mississippi. He knew that the land hadn't been a Dunmore acquisition. It had been a Beaumont inheritance left specifically to Corinne by her grandfather, Raymond Beaumont. Under the law that made it her separate property, she didn't need my signature to change its future. She didn't need anyone's permission to write a codicil that could turn his entire corporate takeover into a pile of worthless ash. "Stay back, Preston," I said. "Dad, be reasonable." He took a half step forward, his hand closing the gap toward the envelope. He never reached it. From beneath the table, a sound emerged that stopped every heart in the Millstone Diner. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't the frantic snapping of a nervous cur. It was a growl, low vibrating, and so precise it felt like a physical barrier being slammed into place. Flint didn't move from his position, but his upper lip curled just enough to flash the white of a canine, and his amber eyes locked onto Preston's throat with a chilling, singular focus. It was a warning typed in lead and delivered in a language that predated law books and medical forms. "One more inch," the dog was saying, "and the world changes forever." Preston froze. His hand stayed suspended in midair, trembling slightly against the yellow light of the diner. Harlan Stowe took a step back, his document case clutched to his chest like a shield. Even the security man at the counter shifted his weight, his eyes darting toward the door, as if looking for an exit that wasn't there. I looked down at the envelope in my hand. The time had come. The tension in the Millstone Diner had reached a point where the air itself felt like it might shatter. Preston's hand was still suspended in that desperate, grasping reach toward Corinne's envelope, his fingers trembling just inches away from Flint's bared teeth. The dog's growl was a physical vibration I could feel through the floorboards. It was the sound of a line being drawn in the delta dirt, a line that once crossed would leave no way back home. Then the bell above the door rang for the third time tonight. It didn't ring with the hesitant jingle of a traveler or the sharp clang of a customer in a hurry. It was a single authoritative chime that sliced through the silence. The door swung open, bringing with it a gust of sharp October air that smelled of wet asphalt and dormant cotton fields. Sheriff Boyd Tanner stepped inside. He didn't move like a man who had just happened to be passing by. He stood in the doorway for a full heartbeat, his tan uniform pressed and sharp, the brass of his badge catching the dim yellow light of the diner. His eyes, pale, weathered blue, performed a sweeping scan of the room that took exactly 1 second. It was a professional's gaze, the kind that didn't just see people but assessed threats, exits, and intent. I watched the man Preston called security, the one I now knew was Silas Croft. The moment Tanner stepped into the light, Silas's face did something it hadn't done all night. It didn't just tighten, it darkened. A flicker of something that looked like ancient cold embers ignited in his eyes. Silas wasn't just surprised. He was looking at the one ghost from his past he hadn't expected to find, standing in a Mississippi diner. Boyd Tanner had been the sheriff of this county for 20 years. I had seen him at town council meetings, at funerals, and at the end of long harvest days. He was a man of few words and a long memory. He ignored the men in black at the door. He ignored the trucker at the counter. He walked straight toward my booth, his boot heels striking the linoleum with a steady, rhythmic thud that seemed to reset the heartbeat of the room. Preston recovered first. He lowered his hand, his mask of corporate composure snapping back into place, though his breathing was still shallow. He stood up, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sheriff Tanner." Preston said, his voice regaining that practiced, authoritative lilt. "I'm glad you're here. We're dealing with a bit of a family crisis. My father is undergoing a necessary medical evaluation, and he's being uncooperative. These gentlemen," he gestured vaguely toward Silas and the others, "are just here for his safety." Tanner didn't look at Preston. He didn't even acknowledge he'd spoken. The sheriff stopped at the edge of the table, his gaze locked onto Silas Croft. For 5 long seconds, neither man moved. It was a silence that carried 5 years of history I didn't yet understand, a history written in police reports and shadow work that had no place in a town like this. Silas had been hired by a private firm Preston found in Jackson, but Silas hadn't taken the job for the paycheck. He had taken it because this was Tanner's territory, a chance to poke a finger in the eye of the man who had run him out of the state years ago. "Silas," Tanner said. His voice was like low-grit sandpaper. I told you in 2021 that if I ever smelled your cologne in this county again, I wouldn't waste time with a summons. Silas didn't flinch, but his hand moved fractionally closer to the asymmetric bulge under his jacket. It's a free country, Boyd. I'm on a private contract. Legal and paid for. Not on my watch, Tanner replied. Finally, the sheriff turned his head and looked down at me. The hardness in his eyes softened, replaced by a weary, familiar respect. Walter, you all right? I looked at him, at the man who had sat on my porch and drank iced tea while Corinne complained about the price of diesel. For the first time tonight, the weight in my chest didn't feel like it was crushing me. I felt like I was finally standing on solid ground after 6 months of treading water. I'm fine, Boyd, I said. Just having a cup of coffee with some people who weren't invited. Tanner nodded once. He reached into his belt and pulled a radio, speaking a few brief words that resulted in 2 squad cars pulling into the gravel lot outside, their blue and red lights beginning to pulse against the diner windows. He looked at Preston then, and the look was cold enough to frost the glass. I've had a deputy watching your security team for 2 weeks, Preston, ever since they started idling at the edge of County Road 518. Loretta gave me the word 10 minutes ago that things were getting crowded in here. Preston's face went pale. Sheriff, you don't understand the legal standing here. Dr. Stowe has... I don't care what Harlan has, Tanner interrupted. He reached into the breast pocket of his uniform, but he didn't pull out a pair of handcuffs. He pulled out an envelope. It was different from the one Corinne had hidden in her Bible. This one was heavy cream-colored and sealed with a thick red wax stamp that bore the imprint of a law firm I recognized from Memphis. It looked official, untouchable, and utterly out of place in a roadside diner. Tanner set it on the table right on top of the cognitive assessment form, covering the pre-checked boxes that were meant to end my life as I knew it. I've been carrying this for 6 months. Walter, Tanner said, his voice quiet enough that only those at the table could hear. Corinne came to my office 2 weeks before she passed. She told me that if Preston ever brought a doctor and a crew of shadows to a Friday night dinner, I was to deliver this personally. He looked at the envelope, then back at me. Oh, she said you'd know what to do with it. She said tonight would be the night she meant. I looked at the red wax seal. My name was written on this one too, but the ink was fresh, protected from the dust of the fields. Preston stared at the second envelope as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. His entire plan, the medical assessment, the guardianship, the corporate takeover, depended on the vacuum of Corinne's absence. He had assumed she was gone. He had assumed the dead couldn't speak in a court of law. He was wrong. Corinne Dunmore had been a Beaumont, and Beaumonts never left a field half-plowed. I reached for the second envelope. My hand steady, my eyes meeting Beckett's. The young man across from me gave a nearly imperceptible nod, his hands finally closing into relaxed fists. The dog, Flint, settled back onto his haunches, his amber eyes still fixed on Silas, but the lethal tension had left his frame. The air in the diner shifted. The hunters were suddenly the ones being watched. Outside, the sirens grew louder. Inside, I broke the red wax seal. The air in the Millstone Diner didn't just feel still. It felt ancient, as if the ghosts of every Beaumont who had ever bled into that Delta soil had crowded into the room to witness what came next. All eyes, from the trucker at the counter to the shadows in black, leaning against the wood-paneled walls, were fixed on the cream-colored envelope in Sheriff Tanner's hand. There are women who prepare for a storm by checking the roof and stocking the cellar. And then there are women like Corinne Beaumont Dunmore, who prepare for a storm by ensuring the wind has nowhere to take hold. She didn't seek control. She sought order. She loved us with a depth that was often quiet, a love so profound, it recognized that the people she left behind might not always be their best selves when the grief took hold. Sheriff Tanner didn't open the envelope immediately. He held it with a reverence that made the room grow even quieter. 6 months ago. Tanner began his voice carrying the slow, steady weight of a man telling a story that had been waiting for its ending. Corinne walked into my office. She came alone. She sat in the chair across from my desk, placed this envelope down, and looked me straight in the eye. She said, "Boyd, you keep this. You open it only when Walter needs protecting from the people who share his last name. You'll know when that time comes." He looked at me, a brief flash of sorrow crossing his face. "I didn't want to believe her, Walter. I didn't want to think a son could push his father to the edge of a cliff just to see what the view looked like from the top." Preston snapped. The cold, calculated mask of the corporate executive finally shattered, leaving behind a man raw with desperate ambition. He stepped forward, his hand slicing through the air. "This is a private family matter, Sheriff. Whatever is in that envelope is irrelevant to the medical emergency happening right now. You have no legal standing to interfere with a doctor's assessment based on a 6-month-old letter." Tanner didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He just held up a hand, a single gesture of authority that made the men in black at the door stiffen. "Move down, Preston," Tanner said. It wasn't a request. Preston hesitated, his eyes darting to Silas Croft, then back to the sheriff. Seeing the blue and red lights of the squad cars strobing against the glass outside, he slowly sank back onto the edge of the booth, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. Tanner broke the red wax seal. The sound of the paper tearing was the only noise in the diner. He pulled out several sheets of heavy vellum, his eyes scanning the first page before he began to read aloud, his voice echoing off the griddle and the vinyl booths. "This is the last will and testament of Corinne Beaumont Dunmore," he read. "Executed and notarized in the county of Coahoma, state of Mississippi, on March 15th, 2024. He paused, looking at the legal header. "I, Corinne Dunmore, being of sound mind, do hereby clarify the status of the 340 acres known as the Beaumont Farm. This land, originally belonging to the Beaumont family estate, passed to me as separate property per the last will of my grandfather Raymond Beaumont in 1987. It was never intended to be, nor has it ever been, commingled with the marital assets of the Dunmore estate." Preston's face went a shade of white I had only seen on marble. He stared at the papers as if they were a death warrant. For years, he had operated under the assumption that the farm was a Dunmore asset, that it belonged to me and through me to him. He had never bothered to check the deed records from 1987. He had never realized that the dirt he walked on didn't belong to the man he was trying to declare incompetent. It belonged to the woman he had underestimated. Tanner continued, his voice growing harder. "As the sole legal owner, I hereby bequeath the entirety of the Beaumont Farm, including all mineral rights and structures, not to my husband Walter, nor to my son Preston, but to the Delta Land Trust and the Magnolia Children's Foundation, to be maintained as a working agricultural preserve in perpetuity." The silence that followed was absolute. Preston looked like a man who had just seen his entire future vanish into a sinkhole. Every calculation, every bribe to Harlan Stowe, every cent spent on Silas Croft's security team, it was all for a prize that had never been on the table. He had been fighting for a kingdom that had already been given away to orphans and conservationists. I sat there staring at the cursive on the pages. Corinne's words. I could hear her voice in every sentence, the quiet steel, the unwavering sense of justice. She had protected the land from the only person who would have sold it off piece by piece for a profit. She had known Preston better than I had. I felt something hot on my cheek. I reached up and realized I was crying. They weren't tears of grief, but of a strange, overwhelming relief. She had seen the storm coming, and she had built a wall high enough to keep us both safe. Across the table, Beckett stayed motionless, but the hardness in his eyes seemed to settle into a quiet respect. He had known. Somehow, in the way soldiers know when the reinforcements have finally arrived, he had known this was coming. Preston started to laugh, a low, jagged sound that had no humor in it. It's a fake. It has to be. My mother wouldn't leave me with nothing. She didn't leave you with nothing, Preston Tanner said, folding the papers. She left you with exactly what you earned. But as of this moment, you have no legal claim to this property, no authority over your father's residence, and no reason to be in this diner. Before Preston could respond, Loretta Givens stepped out from behind the counter. She was holding her phone, the screen glowing against her apron. Her face was set in a line of grim satisfaction. "Ah, Sheriff," Loretta said, her voice steady. "I've got the recording from the kitchen extension. I think you need to hear what Dr. Stowe and Preston were discussing before you walked in, about the financial arrangements for the diagnosis." Preston's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with a new kind of terror. The storm hadn't just arrived. It had started to move inland. The floorboards of the Millstone Diner had always had a particular complaint, a low, rhythmic creak that felt like a familiar greeting. But as Loretta Givens stepped out from behind the counter, her shoes hit the wood with a sharp, hollow cadence that felt more like a steady march toward a gallows. The silence in the room was so brittle that each of her steps seemed to carve a notch into it. I have known Loretta for 10 years. Every Friday night, without fail, she would bring a pot of coffee to our booth. She never asked how we took it. She just placed a cup of black coffee in front of me and another with exactly 1 teaspoon of sugar in front of Corinne. I never once questioned how she remembered. I suppose the people who truly pay attention to you never have to ask. They simply carry your preferences like a small, quiet weight that proves you exist to them. Loretta stopped 3 feet from the table. She didn't look at the sheriff first. She looked at me, and there was a flicker of ancient, neighborly protectiveness in her eyes that made me feel like a child being shielded from a playground bully. "I lived next to your family on the north side of the county for 3 years before I bought this place. Walter," Loretta said, her voice steady but laced with a cold edge. "I saw things you didn't, and I saw the way Preston spoke to Corinne when you were out in the South Fields. The way he'd tower over her in the yard, his voice like a whip, demanding to know when the Beaumont land would finally be signed over to the Dunmore Trust. Corinne never told you because she didn't want to break your heart. But she told me. She told me to keep an eye on you when she was gone." Preston snarled a low, ugly sound. "You're a waitress in a roadside dive, Loretta. Your observations are as worthless as your coffee." Loretta didn't even blink. She held up her phone. "Maybe. But this phone doesn't have an opinion. It just has a memory." She looked at Sheriff Tanner. "They got here 40 minutes before Walter. Sat in that back corner booth. They thought the hum of the refrigerator would cover them. They didn't realize I'd left the kitchen extension off the hook and set my phone to record right next to the receiver." In Mississippi, the law is clear on this. We are a one-party consent state. More importantly, in a public diner where voices carry and privacy is an illusion, there is no reasonable expectation of privacy. When I had walked into the diner earlier that evening, I'd passed their table and caught a fragmented sentence from Preston, a snippet about the transition. At that moment, I became a peripheral participant in a conversation I didn't yet understand I was the subject of. Loretta tapped the screen. The audio was grainy, layered with the distant hiss of the fryer and the low hum of the diner's neon, but the voices were unmistakable. Once we get him in the car, Preston's voice came through the speaker, cold and stripped of all filial warmth. Stowe will sign the cognitive assessment form on the way. I'll have the guardianship petition filed by Monday morning. Whitfield already has a room prepped. They're expecting a high-priority admission. Then came Harlan Stowe's voice, thin and trembling, with a cocktail of greed and fear. What if he recognizes me, Preston? What if he sees through the evaluation? He's an old man, Harlan Preston replied, and the casual cruelty in his tone felt like a physical strike to my ribs. He's tired, he's grieving, and his mind is slipping. By the time we're done, he'll doubt his own memories before he ever doubts you. We tell him he's sick often enough he'll start to believe it. The recording cut off. The phrase, "he'll doubt himself," echoed in my mind over and over like a bell tolling for a funeral. Every doubt I'd had over the last 6 months, every time I'd misplaced my keys or forgotten a date, and felt that cold spike of fear that I was losing my grip, it hadn't been nature. It had been a seed planted by my own son. He hadn't just been waiting for me to fail. He had been trying to convince me that I already had. Whatever was left of the image of the boy I'd raised, the boy who used to help me check the cotton yields, the boy I'd been proud of, it didn't just break. It disintegrated into ash, blown away by the cold wind of that recording. Sheriff Tanner didn't wait. He stepped around the table, his hand moving to the handcuffs on his belt. The heavy metallic clink was the loudest sound in the world. Stika Tuliksa. Preston Dunmore. Tanner said, his voice dropping into the official lethal register of the law. You are being detained on suspicion of conspiracy to commit false imprisonment and medical fraud. That recording provides more than enough probable cause for a detention until the DA can review the intent. Harlan Stowe collapsed back into the booth, his face the color of sour milk. I was only following the clinical signs, Sheriff. I didn't. Save it for the station, Harlan, Tanner snapped. Preston didn't move to run. He was too smart for that, or perhaps too arrogant. He stood his ground, his eyes darting around the room looking for a crack in the wall, a way to spin the narrative back into his favor. He looked at the sheriff, then at Loretta, and finally at me. There was no remorse in his eyes. There was only the simmering rage of a man who had been outplayed by a waitress and a dead woman. Then his gaze shifted. He didn't look at the sheriff anymore. He looked past him toward the far corner where the shadows were deepest. He caught Silas Croft's eye. It was a look that lasted less than a second. A sharp, silent command, the kind a general gives when the front lines have collapsed, and only the scorched earth policy remains. Preston wasn't going to go quietly. If he couldn't have the land, and he couldn't have the guardianship, he was going to ensure there was nothing left for anyone else to hold on to. Silas Croft didn't hesitate. He didn't look at the sheriff's gun or the blue lights outside. He began to move. He stepped away from the counter, his broad shoulders squared, his hand disappearing into the asymmetric fold of his jacket. He wasn't moving toward the door. He was moving toward me, under the table. I felt the weight against my leg shift. Flint didn't growl this time. He didn't give a warning. The big black and tan dog simply launched himself from the shadows, a blur of fur and muscle rising to meet the threat before it could reach the table. I had spent 74 years believing that violence was a thing of loud noises and frantic movements, the sudden roar of a storm, the grinding of gears, the sharp shout of a man in pain. But tonight, in the suffocating stillness of the Millstone Diner, I learned that true violence begins long before the first blow is struck. It starts in the silence that precedes the crash, in that hollow space where every person in the room knows exactly what is coming, and yet no one dares to draw a full breath. Silas Croft began to move. He didn't rush. He drifted across the linoleum with a slow, predatory calculation, each step measured, as if he were testing the weight of the air. Behind him, the three men in black shifted in unison, sliding into positions like chess pieces being pushed across a board by an invisible hand. They weren't looking for a way out anymore. They were looking for a way through. Beckett stood up. He didn't make a show of it, but the way he moved was a masterclass in economy. He stepped between me and Silas, his broad shoulders creating a physical barrier that seemed to reclaim the booth for the side of sanity. Flint was a shadow at his hip, the dog's body lowered, muscles coiled like a steel spring under his dark coat, ready to launch. Sheriff Tanner didn't reach for his sidearm, but his thumb unclipped the leather strap over his holster with a soft, definitive click. He stared directly at Silas Croft, his eyes locked onto the other man's face with a lethal, unwavering focus. Silas. Tanner set his voice a low, gravelly warning. Think very carefully about what you're doing right now. You've crossed a dozen lines tonight, but this one is the end of the road. There's no contract in the world worth the hole I'll put in you if you take another step toward Walter. Silas stopped. It wasn't because he was afraid of the sheriff's warning. It was because looking at Tanner seemed to activate something older and deeper within him, a reservoir of bitterness that had been fermenting for years. He tilted his head, a ghost of a jagged smile touching his lips. You always did like the sound of your own voice, Boyd, Silas said, and the resentment in his tone was palpable. You took everything from me 5 years ago. My badge, my pension, my name in this county. You threw me to the wolves because you couldn't handle a little irregular police work on the border. Tanner didn't blink. He didn't give an inch of ground. You took those things from yourself, Silas. I just didn't look away when you started taking bribes from the cattle rustlers. I gave you a chance to resign quietly, and you chose to burn the house down on your way out. The air between them was electric, with a history I was only just beginning to piece together. Silas Croft hadn't just been a hired gun, he had been a deputy, a man who once wore the same tan uniform as the man now standing in his way. Behind Silas, the front door swung open again. This time it wasn't a stranger. 2 of Tanner's deputies' men I'd seen at the county fair, men who knew the layout of every farm in this district, stepped inside with their service weapons drawn, but held at the low ready. Loretta had done more than just record a conversation. She had ensured the cavalry arrived exactly when the walls started to close in. The 3 men in black assessed the situation. They looked at the 2 deputies at the door, then at Beckett's cold, expectant gaze, and finally at the sheriff. One by one, their hands came away from their jackets and rose slowly into the air. They were professionals, and professionals knew when the math didn't add up in their favor. Silas stood alone in the center of the diner, a man caught between a past he couldn't outrun and a future that was rapidly shrinking to the size of a jail cell. Preston, seeing his last line of defense dissolve into a surrender, changed his strategy one final time. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like desperation but sounded like glass breaking. He turned to me, his hands shaking, his voice cracking at the edges. "Dad," he said, and the word felt like a lie. "Dad, listen to me. Whatever Mom left behind, whatever these people are telling you, I'm still your son. I'm the one who stayed. I'm the one who managed the books while you were out staring at the fields. Doesn't that count for something? You can't just let them take me away. We're family, Dad. We're Dunmores." I looked at my son. For the first time all night, I saw something real in his eyes. It wasn't love. It wasn't regret for the father he had tried to lock away, or the mother whose legacy he had tried to pillage. It was the raw, naked fear of a man who had gambled everything on a lie and just realized the house had won. He didn't want my forgiveness. He wanted my protection. He wanted the father he had just called diminished to step in and save him from the consequences of his own cruelty. I leaned back in the booth, the weight of the Bible in my pocket, and the warmth of flint against my leg, providing the only anchors I had left. "You were right about one thing, Preston," I said, and my voice sounded like the dry rustle of October stalks. "I am an old man, but an old man knows the difference between a family and a transaction. You didn't stay for me. You stayed for the dirt, and the dirt has already made its decision." Silas Croft finally lowered his hands. The fire in his eyes died down into a cold, flat gray. He didn't look at Tanner as the deputies moved in to cuff him. He looked at Beckett, a long, searching gaze that seemed to acknowledge a peer in a room full of amateurs. Beckett didn't move until the metallic clack of the handcuffs echoed through the diner. Only then did he exhale his frame, losing that lethal, coiled tension. He sat back down across from me, his face returning to that calm, unreadable mask I had seen when he first walked in. The deputies led Silas and the others out into the swirling blue and red lights of the parking lot. Sheriff Tanner stayed behind, his hand resting on the back of the booth, as he watched Preston being escorted toward the door. His son's head bowed his expensive Italian suit, looking like a shroud in the yellow diner light. The diner was quiet again, save for the hiss of the coffee machine and the low murmur of the radio. I looked at Beckett. He was still sitting in Corinne's chair, his hands resting on the table, the hands that had asked for nothing and offered everything. He had been the catalyst for everything that had happened tonight, the silent guardian who had known the shape of the storm before the first cloud appeared. "Oh, who are you really?" I asked him. It was the same question I'd asked before, but tonight, under the weight of everything we had just survived, it felt like the only question that mattered. "And why did you care enough about an old farmer to stand in the way of a bullet?" Beckett looked at the empty coffee cup in front of him, then up at me. I didn't do it for the farm, Mr. Dunmore," he said quietly. "I did it for the promise I made to the only woman who ever gave me a second chance." The blue and red lights of the squad cars continued to strobe against the diner windows, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the floorboards. Outside, the world was loud with the crackle of radios and the slamming of car doors. Inside, the Millstone Diner had become a cathedral of spent adrenaline. It was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a room where something fundamental has shattered, and the glass hasn't been swept up yet. I had asked the question since the moment he sat down. "Who are you?" For hours the answer had been a ghost haunting the edges of our conversation. But as I sat there, watching the deputies lead the remnants of Preston's ambition into the night, I began to understand that some answers don't come when you demand them. They come only when the room is empty enough to hold them. They come when you are finally ready to listen. Beckett didn't stand. He shifted his chair closer to mine, shedding the lethal, coiled posture of a soldier for the first time all night. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a register that was meant for only two people. A low, steady murmur that seemed to hum beneath the sound of the wind outside. "My name is Beckett Harlow," he said. He paused, his gaze fixed on the table as if he were reading the words off the grain of the wood. "My mother's name before she married you was Corinne Beaumont." I sat perfectly still. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. My mind, a machine that had been running on the fumes of survival for hours, suddenly seized. I tried to process the syllables, to fit them into the architecture of the 41 years I had shared with that woman. Corinne. My Corinne. She found me 3 years ago. Beckett continued, his voice never wavering. A private investigator, an old P.O. box in Clarksdale, and a lot of patience. We wrote letters, Walter. Only letters. She never told you because she didn't want to change the life you two had built. She wanted that to stay pure away from the shadows of her past. But she knew. She knew the way the wind was turning. He looked at me then, and the weight of the revelation hit me like a physical force. She reached out to me because she saw the greed taking root in Preston long before he ever realized it himself, Beckett said. She knew that after she was gone, he'd come for the land, and he'd come for you. She asked me to keep a promise. She asked me to be the shadow he never saw coming. The brilliance of her plan was staggering and heartbreaking. Corinne had operated in the blind spot of Preston's arrogance. Preston was a man of ledgers, of titles, of legal standing. He had spent months investigating every asset, every debt, every Dunmore connection. But he had never bothered to look at who Corinne Beaumont was before she became his mother. To him, she was a fixture of the farm, a source of his inheritance. He never imagined she had a history that didn't include him. He never looked for a son named Harlow, because he didn't believe his mother was capable of having a secret that large. I carry my father's name, Harlow, Beckett said. There are no papers linking me to Corinne Dunmore, no birth certificate in this county, no digital trail for Preston's lawyers to find. I was the one variable he couldn't account for because he didn't respect the woman enough to fear her past. I looked at Beckett, really looked at him under the dim yellow light of the diner lamp. I searched his face, stripping away the soldier's haircut and the jagged scar on his wrist. And there, in the tilt of his head and the steady, uncompromising depth of his gaze, I saw it. The green, the exact shade of Delta moss after a spring rain. The eyes I had loved for 4 decades. The eyes that had looked at me across 1,000 breakfast tables and through the pain of her final days, were looking at me right now from the face of this stranger. It wasn't a resemblance. It was a signature. Beckett placed his hand flat on the table, palms up, showing the small, pale scar on his left wrist. It was the same gesture from the beginning of the night, the open hands of a man who had nothing to hide and nothing to take. She said you were a good man, Walter, he whispered. She said you were a man who deserved to live out his days in the peace of the land you worked. I promised her I'd make sure of that, and a soldier keeps his word. I didn't cry. I had run dry of tears somewhere between the diabolical recording and the reading of the will. Instead, I felt a massive, hollow space in my chest, a hole that had been there since the day we buried her, slowly beginning to fill with something I didn't have a name for. It wasn't just safety, it was the realization that even in her absence, Corinne was still taking care of me. She had reached out across time and blood to send me a guardian. The door to the diner opened. Sheriff Tanner was leading the last of them out. Preston was led past our booth, his hands cuffed behind his back, his head finally beginning to lift as the initial shock wore off. As he reached our table, he stopped. A deputy nudged him, but Preston ignored it. He looked at me, then his gaze slid to Beckett. I watched it happen. I watched the moment the recognition flickered in Preston's eyes, a faint, blurred memory of a photograph he might have seen in a hidden box, or perhaps just the haunting familiarity of a bone structure he shared. The color drained from his face until he looked like a man made of ash. The realization that he hadn't been outplayed by a stranger but by a brother he never knew existed, sent by a mother he thought he'd defeated, was the final blow. Preston's face didn't just fall, it collapsed. The last shred of his corporate pride, his Dunmore entitlement, vanished. He looked at Beckett with a terror that was absolute, and then he looked away, unable to meet the green eyes that were his own mother's judgment. "Move it, Preston," the deputy said. They led him out into the cold October night. I looked back at Beckett, the man who wasn't a Dunmore but who carried the best of the Beaumonts in his blood. "What happens now?" I asked. Beckett gave a small, weary smile and whistled low. Flint stood up his tail, giving a single slow thump against the floor. "Now, Walter." Beckett said, "I think we go home." The fog was still dragging its heavy skirts across the south fields when we pulled into the gravel drive of the Dunmore farm, or rather the Beaumont farm. The distinction felt sharper now, like a freshly honed blade. For 41 years I had called this place mine, but as the headlights of the truck cut through the gray delta mist, I realized I was merely the last sentinel of a legacy that Corinne had saved from the inside out. Beckett drove. He handled the old Ford with the same quiet competence he'd shown in the diner. No wasted movements, no unnecessary talk. Flint sat in the middle, his large head resting on the dashboard, watching the familiar fence lines pass by. We stepped out of the truck, and the cold morning air hit me smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. It was the smell of a world that had reset itself. She always loved this hour. I said, my voice sounding thin in the vast quiet of the fields. She said the land told its best secrets before the sun came up to distract it. Beckett stood by the truck, his green eyes, her eyes scanning the horizon. She told me about the oak tree by the creek, the one where you carved her initials in 1985. She said it was the only time she ever saw you act like a sentimental man. I looked at him, surprised. That was a detail I hadn't thought about in a decade. A small, private moment buried under years of harvests and taxes. She remembered that. She remembered everything, Walter. That's why she sent me. She knew that a man who carves a name into an oak tree isn't the kind of man who deserves to be forgotten in a ward. We walked toward the house. The screen door gave its familiar, rusty protest as I opened it. Inside the kitchen was exactly as I'd left it, the half-finished bowl of soup, the empty chair across from mine. But the shadows that had been haunting the corners for 6 months felt different now. They weren't heavy with grief anymore. They were light with a strange, lingering presence. I sat at the table and placed Corinne's Bible in the center. Beside it lay the cream-colored envelope from Sheriff Tanner, the legal shield that guaranteed my life estate. I would stay here until the end. The land trust would manage the soil, the children's foundation would benefit from the yields, and Preston would have a long time to think about the difference between price and value in a state sell. Beckett didn't sit. He stayed by the door, his dark jacket buttoned against the draft. "You're not staying," I said. It wasn't a question. "I made a promise to watch over you tonight, Walter, and I made a promise to make sure the land was safe. The lawyers will handle the rest of the paperwork for the trust. My job is done. You have a claim, Beckett. Blood is blood, regardless of what the deeds say. You're a Beaumont." He gave a small, weary smile, the smile of a man who had traveled too far to ever truly settle again. "I'm a Harlow Walter. My mother gave me a second chance 3 years ago, and that was enough. I don't need the dirt. I just needed to know the man she loved was going to be okay." He whistled low, and Flint moved to his side. The dog gave me one last look, a steady amber gaze that seemed to acknowledge our shared watch, and then turned toward the door. "Where will you go?" I asked. "Wherever the wind is blowing cold," Beckett replied. "There are other people out there with shadows behind them, Walter. Sometimes they need a man with open hands to stand in the way." I watched him walk back to the truck. The sun was just beginning to crack the horizon, bleeding a pale, watery gold across the cotton stalks. As the engine turned over and the taillights faded into the mist, I felt the massive hollow in my chest finally close. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. Corinne had been standing watch all along, weaving a web of protection that spanned decades and bloodlines. I reached out and touched the empty chair across from me. For the first time in 6 months, I didn't feel the ache of her absence. I felt the strength of her spine. I stood up, walked to the stove, and started a fresh pot of coffee. Black for me. And in my mind, I set out a cup with exactly 1 spoonful of sugar. The gold-hued neon of the Millstone Diner was beginning to lose its battle against the first gray filter of morning light. Outside, Highway 61 stirred to life the distant, rhythmic hum of a long-haul truck, breaking the silence of the Delta. There are nights that don't end in solutions. They end in truth. And sometimes the truth isn't any gentler than the problem. It is simply more real, a hard stone at the bottom of a shallow river. Beckett sat beside me now, no longer a soldier on a mission, but a man holding a weight he'd carried for 3 years. Flint lay across my boots, his chin resting on my laces, his steady breathing a quiet anchor. Loretta moved between the booths with the ghost-like efficiency of someone who had seen 1,000 mornings like this, refilling our cups without a word. "Tell me about her," I said, my voice sounding like gravel after the long night. "The letters? What did she talk about?" Beckett looked at the steam rising from his cup. "Everything, Walter. She learned I took my coffee black, just like you. She described the farm in October, how the fields looked like they'd been covered in a heavy white snow when the cotton opened up. But mostly, she talked about you." He turned to look at me, and again I saw Corinne's steady green gaze. "She described you the same way in every single letter, a man who stays." I looked away toward the fogged-up glass. I understood then. Corinne hadn't just been preparing for a legal battle. She had been curating a legacy of character. She hadn't left me alone. She just couldn't stay herself. She had spent 3 years building a bridge I didn't even know I needed until the moment I was standing at the edge of a cliff. But one question remained, a small, jagged splinter in my chest. Did she ever say she was sorry?" I asked, the words catching in my throat. "For not telling me, for keeping you a secret all those years." Beckett reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a worn, yellowed envelope. It wasn't crisp or formal like the lawyer's documents. It was soft, the edges frayed from being handled. My name was written on the front, in that elegant looping cursive I would know in the dark. "She asked me to give you this," Beckett whispered, "only when the dust settled. Only if I felt the time was right." I took the envelope. I didn't open it. I just rested my hand over the paper, feeling the indentations of her pen, a tactile echo of her hand across time. I didn't need to read it yet. The fact that it existed was the apology. She had known me well enough to know I'd eventually find my way to this exact seat, on this exact night, asking this exact question. I reached out and placed my hand on Beckett's shoulder. It was a heavy, calloused hand, the hand of a farmer who had worked the same 340 acres for 50 years. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. Beckett didn't pull away. He sat there, a soldier who had finally come home from a war he hadn't asked to fight. And for a moment, the blood between us felt thicker than the years of silence. Outside, the Mississippi sky was beginning to bleed into a soft, bruised pink in the east. The morning was coming. The 340 acres of Beaumont soil would go to the trust, just as Corinne intended. Preston would face a judge, and Silas and Stowe would face the cold consequences of their choices. But those were matters for the daylight. Now, in the fading yellow light of a diner on Highway 61, Walter Dunmore sat beside the son he never knew he had. I had the dog of a stranger at my feet and the final words of my wife in my hand. Corinne always said the right people find each other eventually. Looking at Beckett, I realized she was talking about more than just the two of us. She was talking about a life that was finally whole,